You people should stick to cleaning and serving." That was the first thing Naomi Carter heard as she walked into the private conference suite on the top floor of St. Gregor Memorial Hospital. It wasn't whispered. It wasn't subtle. It was said aloud, by a white-coated man with a Harvard pin on his lapel, in front of 5 other doctors who didn't blink. Naomi didn't flinch. She had heard worse. But something about tonight felt different. There was a tension in the air, like something terrible was unfolding in slow motion. And she was standing in the middle of it. It was 2:17 a.m. The entire top floor had been locked down for hours. Billionaire CEO Wesley Kane, founder of Waitress, was dying. His condition was deteriorating rapidly despite the presence of 20 of the country's most decorated medical professionals. Liver function was collapsing. Neurological responses had gone silent. Machines beeped like countdowns. The air was heavy with cologne, antiseptic, and failure. Naomi Carter was there to deliver tea. Not opinions. Not expertise. But what they didn't know, what they never cared to ask, was that Naomi had once been a rising pre-med star at UCLA. Before the system spat her out. Before a professor's assistant accused her of cheating, without evidence, and no one stood up for the black girl with too much ambition and not enough protection. She'd rebuilt herself as best she could, working nights to support her mother and little sister. But she never stopped reading, never stopped learning. And tonight, as she smelled the air in that room, something clicked. A sharp, metallic scent. A bitter tang that didn't belong in tea. Or in food. Or in skincare. Something Wesley Kane had ingested. She recognized the signs. And she knew, if no one else saw it, he would die before sunrise. This is a black story. About how the truth doesn't always wear a white coat. And how brilliance can come from the most unexpected place. If stories like this matter to you, stick around. This one's going to crack something wide open. St. Gregor Memorial wasn't just a hospital, it was a fortress for the elite. Perched on a hill overlooking the San Francisco Bay, its top floor looked less like a medical facility and more like a luxury hotel. Walnut-paneled walls, ambient lighting, and discreet security cameras lined the hallways. On paper, this was a place for healing. In reality, it was a place where power played by its own rules. Wesley Kane had earned that power. At 44, he was already a legend in Silicon Valley. The founder and CEO of Waitress, a tech giant responsible for the most advanced AI neural chip on the market, he'd built an empire from scratch. He was a media darling, a keynote speaker, and, until recently, a man in perfect health. Now, lying in a hospital bed hooked to machines, Wesley Kane was a mystery no one could solve. His decline had been sudden, almost theatrical. Fatigue, nausea, then severe neurological symptoms. His hair began falling out in unusual patches. His speech slurred. Blood tests gave conflicting results. And the harder the doctors tried to define it, the worse he got. 20 specialists had been summoned from around the country. Neurologists, toxicologists, immunologists, all of them armed with degrees from Ivy League schools and reputations built on saving people like Wesley Kane. And yet, none of them had a clue. Naomi Carter didn't belong in that world. At 26, she was just the night waitress. She wore a plain black uniform, sensible shoes, and her name tag was scratched at the edges. But her posture was always straight. Her eyes sharp. She was the kind of woman who noticed everything, even when no one noticed her. Naomi had once dreamed of being on the other side of that hospital room, wearing a white coat, holding a clipboard. But the world had other plans. After the academic scandal at UCLA, no other school would touch her. She was branded. A whisper, a lie, and her future was gone. So she served drinks and cleared dishes. But tonight, she was watching a billionaire die. And she was seeing something no one else in that building could see. Because sometimes, the smartest person in the room isn't holding a stethoscope. Sometimes, she's holding a tray. And watching everyone else miss the truth. It wasn't just the stares that Naomi Carter had grown used to. It was the tone. The kind of tone people used when they didn't have to raise their voice to remind you exactly where you stood. She heard it in the clipped orders from the head nurse, the cold glances from the residents as they passed her in the hallway without a word, the way the elevator door would close a little faster when she approached. At St. Gregor, Naomi had a clearance badge like every other employee, but hers never seemed to work quite the same. The private wing where Wesley Kane was being treated had a security checkpoint with a biometric scanner. The guard, a tall man with gray eyes and a sharp jawline, looked Naomi up and down as if her presence was a joke. He scanned her badge, then asked for her ID, even though he'd seen her a dozen times before. "Procedure," he said flatly, not meeting her eyes. Inside the suite, things weren't much different. Naomi brought a tray of hot tea and sparkling water into the consultation lounge. A room full of white coats and expensive watches barely acknowledged her. One doctor, a middle-aged man with slicked back hair and perfect teeth, smirked and said under his breath, "They're letting the catering staff sit in on medical crises now?" No one corrected him. No one even flinched. Naomi placed the tray on the table silently, her back straight, her eyes calm. But inside, something twisted. This wasn't new. She had faced it before, on campus, during interviews, in casual conversation. People didn't have to say the words for her to feel them. Unspoken, but loud. That she didn't belong. That someone like her could serve drinks, not solutions. But what stung more than the ignorance was the certainty. The way they didn't just doubt her, they dismissed her entirely. As if her mind, her past, her story didn't matter. As if her skin alone told them everything they needed to know. Naomi had long since learned to bury her reactions. But tonight, the weight of it pressed harder. Not just because of the insult, but because she knew something was wrong with the man they were all supposed to be saving. And she also knew none of them were going to listen. Because the truth, coming from a black waitress, would never sound like truth to them. Not unless she forced them to hear it. Naomi Carter was trained to deliver food, not analyze it. But old habits die hard, especially when your first instinct is science. As she wheeled the cart into the private dining area adjacent to Wesley Kane's suite, she noticed the remnants of his last meal. A half-eaten steak, untouched asparagus, and a delicate porcelain plate smeared with a creamy, gray-tinted sauce. Naomi paused. Not because it looked unusual, but because it smelled wrong. There was a sharpness to the scent, metallic and oddly sour. Faint, but present. The kind of smell that would go unnoticed unless you were close, or trained to notice it. Back in her UCLA days, Naomi had studied chemical compounds for hours. Late nights in the lab, sniffing reagents, learning to recognize molecular signatures by scent alone. One compound stuck in her memory: mycotoxins. Fungal byproducts, often used in biological research, occasionally found in contaminated imports. Dangerous in large doses. Even worse in small, consistent ones. She stared at the sauce again. The odd gray sheen. The faint shimmer under the overhead light. She wasn't supposed to touch anything. But she'd already touched the truth once, and been punished for it. She wasn't about to ignore another warning sign now. Using a spoon from the tray, Naomi gently scooped a bit of the sauce into a disposable creamer cup and slipped it into the side pocket of her apron. She wasn't sure what she was going to do with it, yet. But instinct told her it mattered. Moments later, she heard laughter from down the hall. She turned and saw a sharply dressed man leaving Wesley's suite. Tall, confident, familiar. It was Colin Hartley, Wesley Kane's former co-founder and now reconciled business partner. The media loved their made-up redemption arc, two tech giants turning enemies into friends. But Naomi had seen enough powerful men in sanitized press photos to know that smiles didn't always mean sincerity. And she had noticed something else too. Every time Hartley visited, he brought something with him. A catered meal. A care package. And every time, Wesley's condition got worse within 24 hours. Naomi watched Hartley stroll down the corridor like he owned the place. She turned back to the food cart, staring again at the plate. Her gut told her the answer wasn't in the machines, the scans, or the blood work. It was in the sauce. And nobody else was even looking. Naomi Carter didn't have a lab coat, but she had something more valuable: memory. That night, after her shift ended, she sat alone in the break room with a cup of cold coffee and the small plastic creamer container she had carefully sealed. Inside was the tiniest smear of sauce, the kind of thing no one else would even notice. But to Naomi, it was a clue. Maybe the only one that mattered. She reached into her tote bag and pulled out a small test kit she kept tucked behind her lunch container. It wasn't medical-grade equipment. Just a basic food safety testing kit she'd picked up months ago on a whim, more curiosity than necessity. She laid out the test strips, a sample swab, and a small glass dish. Working methodically, Naomi dabbed a toothpick into the sauce and smeared it onto the strip. She waited. The indicator turned yellow, then orange, then red. A positive response for contamination. But it wasn't bacterial. The coloration hinted at a specific compound. Something toxic. Something rare. Naomi's hands worked quickly, her movements practiced. She remembered the color chart from her pre-med years, the one burned into her brain after so many hours of toxicology labs. This wasn't just spoiled food. This was deliberate. Her mind began connecting the dots. The metallic scent. The sharp bitterness. The odd neurological symptoms. The hair loss. The confusion. She pulled out a notebook from her bag, flipping to a blank page, and began listing what she knew. A Wesley Cain symptoms: tremors, confusion, hair loss, liver failure. A timeline: worsens within 24 hours of Hartley's visits. A pattern: each time Hartley brings food, symptoms spike. A compound: indicators: likely mycotoxin or synthetic analog. It wasn't enough to confirm a diagnosis, but it was enough to know she was right. She stared at the notes, heart pounding. The problem wasn't just that no one believed her. The problem was, they weren't even looking in the right direction. She knew this feeling. The quiet certainty. The knowledge that the answer was right in front of them, and no one saw it because of who was holding it. Naomi packed up her test kit, wiped down the table, and slid the evidence into a Ziploc bag. She didn't have a PhD, but she had proof. And tomorrow, she would decide what to do with it. Naomi Carter didn't sleep that night. She came in early for her next shift, dressed in the same black uniform, same shoes, same badge. But something inside her felt different. She had evidence now. She had clarity. And even if no one else had asked for it, she was going to speak. The morning doctor's meeting was being held in the East Conference Lounge, just outside Wesley Cain's suite. The air in the hallway buzzed with authority. Naomi timed her approach perfectly. Coffee tray in one hand, small envelope in the other. She entered the room quietly. 20 doctors. All white coats. All seated in a perfect circle around the head physician, Dr. Bradford Linwood. Naomi placed the coffee on the center table, then stepped toward him. "Excuse me, Dr. Linwood," she said calmly, holding out the envelope. "I think this might help. It's about Mr. Cain. I believe he's being poisoned. There are signs of mycotoxins. I tested the sauce from last night's meal, and that was as far as she got." Dr. Linwood blinked, then laughed. A sharp, clipped laugh that sounded more like a cough. The others turned toward her, some frowning, some amused. "I'm sorry, who are you?" he asked, even though he had seen her every day for months. "I'm Naomi Carter. I work in the executive dining service, but I used to study pre-med at UCLA. I know it sounds unorthodox, but if you look at the progression of symptoms..." "You tested his food," another doctor interrupted, eyebrows raised in disbelief. "Using what, your lunchbox?" Laughter followed. "Cold. Easy. I'm going to assume this is a joke," Dr. Linwood said. "We've run every toxicology panel imaginable. Leave the diagnostics to those with degrees. This is not your place." Naomi stood there, envelope still in her hand. Her cheeks burned. Not from shame, but from anger. I understand, she said quietly, stepping back. No, he replied. You clearly don't. This is a medical emergency, not a science fair. As she turned to leave, someone muttered behind her, they always think they're the exception. She walked out of that room holding back everything she wanted to scream. And yet, deep down, she knew she wasn't wrong. They didn't dismiss her because she was incorrect. They dismissed her because they couldn't imagine someone like her being right. And that was going to cost them. By the time Naomi Carter returned to the staff lounge, the whispers had already started. She could feel it, the shift in the room, the way eyes glanced her way and then quickly looked down. One server wouldn't meet her gaze. Another simply gathered her things and left without saying a word. Even the cafeteria manager, usually polite to a fault, avoided her entirely. 10 minutes later, she was summoned to the basement level, human resources. The room was small, sterile, too cold for comfort. Across the table sat Mrs. Sanders, the compliance officer. Her tone was clipped, her smile thin and tight. We've received a report, Miss Carter, she began, folding her hands over a printed document. Apparently, you interfered with an ongoing medical consultation, entered without clearance, made unsolicited diagnostic suggestions. Naomi opened her mouth, but Mrs. Sanders raised a hand. This is not about your intentions, she said. It's about protocol, chain of command, liability. I saw something, Naomi replied, voice steady. I recognized signs the team might have missed. All I did was try to help. Mrs. Sanders shook her head slightly. And in doing so, you put this hospital in a very uncomfortable position. Naomi's stomach tightened. You are being issued a formal warning, Mrs. Sanders continued. Any further behavior of this nature will result in termination. The word hit harder than she expected. Not because she was afraid of losing a job, but because of what it represented. The threat wasn't just professional. It was personal. A reminder that her voice didn't belong here. That if she dared speak again, she would pay for it. Naomi signed the paper. She had no choice. She left the HR office and walked the long hallway back to the elevator in silence. As the doors closed, her reflection stared back at her in the polished steel. Not angry. Not defeated. Focused. Because even if they were trying to silence her, Naomi had already seen too much to stop now. She had evidence. She had instincts. And most of all, she had the truth. They could dismiss her. They could humiliate her. But they could not ignore what was killing Wesley Kane. And she wasn't done fighting yet. Naomi Carter had learned to move through the hospital like a shadow. After the HR warning, she kept her head down, her steps quiet, and her thoughts locked tight. But that didn't mean she stopped thinking. Or watching. Wesley Kane was getting worse. She saw it in his chart while passing through with fresh linens. She heard it in the hushed voices of nurses outside his door. Confusion had turned to delirium. His kidneys were beginning to shut down. She had to try again. But this time, not alone. As she stood by the vending machine on her break, a soft voice interrupted her spiral of thought. You were right, weren't you? Naomi turned. Standing beside her was Mylin Tran, a third-year resident, quiet, composed, with eyes that missed nothing. Naomi had seen her around, always polite, always professional. But they had never spoken beyond pleasantries. You tested the sauce, My said in a low voice. And you said it came back hot for toxins. Naomi nodded slowly. They left. I got a warning from HR. I'm this close to being fired. Mylin glanced around. The hallway was empty. I believe you, she said. And I can get you something that might help. Naomi raised an eyebrow, cautious but curious. Wesley's full blood work from the last 72 hours. Off the record, Mai continued. But you'll need to look fast. Later that night, when most of the hospital had gone quiet, Mai passed Naomi a flash drive. No words. Just a nod. Naomi brought it home, heart racing. She didn't have a high-tech lab, but her laptop still had the software from her UCLA days. She input the data, and what she saw confirmed everything she feared. The blood work showed rising levels of HTX-91, a rare synthetic mycotoxin. Hard to detect, harder to treat, but unmistakable once you knew where to look. It wasn't food poisoning. It was sabotage. Naomi leaned back in her chair, the room spinning. Someone was trying to kill Wesley Kane. Slowly, methodically. And now she had proof. Real proofs. She looked at the flash drive in her hand. One woman's belief had just changed everything. She wasn't alone anymore. And the truth was finally starting to speak. Naomi Carter didn't sleep. Again. She spent the night cross-checking everything. Wesley Kane's blood results, the timing of his symptoms, the delivery logs from the executive dining service. And every path led to one name. Colin Hartley. Wesley's former rival, turned friend. The man who always brought something. The man whose visits always coincided with another downward spiral. Naomi didn't need more proof. She needed to be heard. And this time, she wasn't asking. At 11:05 a.m., a critical meeting had been called in Conference Room B, just steps away from Wesley's suite. Every attending physician was present. Administrators. Legal advisors. Colin Hartley himself, sitting calmly near the end of the table in a navy suit, fingers steepled, expression unreadable. Naomi waited until the door closed and the conversation began. Then she walked in. Without knocking. The room fell silent. Dr. Linwood stood up halfway, already preparing to cut her off. "Miss Carter, this is not the time." Naomi didn't stop walking. She placed a folder on the table. Inside, printed test results, timeline overlays, the blood analysis, and the flash drive from Mylin. "You're running out of time," Naomi said calmly. "And so is Mr. Kane." She looked at the doctors, then directly at Colin Hartley. "I believe he's being poisoned. Slowly. Deliberately. HTX-91, a synthetic fungal toxin. It's in his bloodstream. It's in the food Hartley's been bringing." "You're insane," Hartley snapped, his voice tight but rising. "This is slander." Naomi didn't flinch. "Your name's on the visitor log every time the symptoms escalate. You've been posing as a friend while delivering a toxin designed to avoid standard detection." Dr. Linwood's expression had changed. He looked down at the papers Naomi brought, confusion giving way to discomfort. "This is serious," one of the younger doctors muttered, flipping through the charts. "It's not just serious," Naomi said. "It's attempted murder." Security was called, not for Naomi, but for Hartley. One glance at the evidence and the hospital's legal counsel made the decision. "Lock the building down. Nobody leaves." As two guards approached him, Hartley stood up with his hands raised. "This is a mistake," he hissed. "You're all making a huge mistake." But nobody moved to stop it. Naomi watched him go. Her hands were shaking, but not from fear. From justice finally stepping into the room. By noon, the entire hospital knew what had happened. Word spread fast, faster than Naomi Carter could process it. That the billionaire in the penthouse suite had been poisoned. That it wasn't a disease or rare condition but a human act. And that the person who figured it out wasn't a doctor. Naomi stood quietly in the hallway outside the conference room as the FBI arrived. Agents in plain suits walked past her, carrying evidence bags. One paused, glancing at her badge. "You the one who flagged this?" he asked. Naomi nodded once. The agent gave a quick nod back, almost like respect, but quiet, understated. Then he moved on. Inside Wesley Kane's room, things had shifted. The medical team, once scattered and confused, was now focused, locked in. They began treating him for HTX-91 toxicity. No more vague theories. No more experimental meds. Real answers. Real action. Dr. Linwood, for the first time since Naomi met him, looked humbled. He reviewed her printouts, checked the timestamps, asked questions, and listened. It was Dr. Maya Gonzalez, one of the few female physicians on the team, who spoke the words Naomi would remember forever. She saved his life, Dr. Gonzalez said clearly. None of us did. She did. Nobody argued. Nobody could. Wesley's vitals began to stabilize by evening. His blood pressure, which had dipped dangerously low for days, began climbing toward normal. His temperature regulated. His pulse smoothed out. Small changes, but undeniable. Life returning. And Naomi? She was no longer invisible. Doctors nodded at her in the hallway. Nurses whispered her name with something between awe and guilt. A few apologized. Some sincerely. Some awkwardly. But it didn't matter. The shift had happened. She wasn't just the waitress anymore. She was the reason a man was still breathing. Later that evening, as she sat quietly in the staff break room, Mylin placed a hand on her shoulder. "They see you now," she said softly. Naomi smiled, just a little. "Yeah," she whispered. Took them long enough. But inside, she knew, it wasn't about being seen. It was about being believed. And from now on, that truth couldn't be taken back. The girl they tried to silence had become the voice that saved a life. The next morning, the hospital lobby was flooded with reporters. News vans lined the street outside. Cameras rolled. Microphones were raised. Headlines scrolled across national broadcasts. Billionaire CEO poisoned in San Francisco hospital. Suspect arrested. Attempted murder investigation ongoing. And in the center of it all, one name kept surfacing: Naomi Carter. Inside St. Gregor Memorial, things moved fast. Wesley Kane's condition was no longer critical. He was awake, groggy, but stable. He'd asked to meet the woman who saved his life. Administrators scrambled. The hospital board convened. And for the first time, Naomi was called into a meeting not to be reprimanded, but to be thanked. Dr. Linwood stood awkwardly at the head of the long mahogany table. "We owe you an apology," he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "You saw what we didn't. And you had the courage to speak when no one else would listen." Naomi said nothing. She didn't need to. Hospital leadership announced an official commendation for exceptional observational skill and unwavering integrity under pressure. They also offered to reinstate her into their sponsored nursing program. But Naomi had something bigger in mind. Outside the hospital, the consequences were even greater. Colin Hartley was in federal custody, facing charges of attempted murder, corporate sabotage, and conspiracy. His motive? According to investigators, it was greed. He stood to gain full control of their joint tech empire if Wesley died before the merger was finalized. Hartley's fingerprints were found on the tampered packaging. Surveillance confirmed everything Naomi had tracked. And the public. They rallied behind her. Social media exploded with hashtags. Hashtag justice for Naomi. Hashtag black brilliance. Hashtag she saved him. People called her a hero. Others called her a genius. But Naomi didn't care about either label. She cared that the truth was no longer buried. Back inside the hospital, one more conversation remained. Dr. Linwood approached her again. "You were right," he admitted. "I was wrong." Naomi gave a small nod. "I didn't need you to say that," she replied. "But I needed you to hear it." He nodded slowly, accepting the weight of it. Because in that moment, they both understood, recognition was never about the applause. It was about accountability. And this time, the system had no choice but to acknowledge the black woman they tried to silence. She wasn't just seen now. She was remembered. Naomi Carter walked out of St. Gregor Memorial Hospital 2 days later with her head high, her apron folded neatly under her arm, and her name echoing down corridors that used to ignore her. She didn't quit. She didn't walk away bitter or triumphant. She walked away transformed. Because the real win wasn't in saving a billionaire. It was in proving, without shouting, without a title, without permission, that knowledge, courage, and truth do not belong to those with degrees or power. They belong to those willing to stand for what they know, even when the world tells them to sit down. Naomi's story is more than a black story. It's an American story. A reminder that bias wears many faces, and sometimes the most dangerous form is the silent one that says, "You don't belong." But Naomi never asked to belong. She asked to be heard. And when the moment came, she didn't just speak, she acted. Even when it risked her job, her reputation, her future. Because some truths are worth the cost. Today, Naomi is back in school. Not because someone gave her permission, but because she took her power back. She studies toxicology with a full scholarship, funded by the very man whose life she saved. She still walks with quiet grace. Still watches closely. But now, when she speaks, people listen. The doctors who once mocked her now cite her name in lectures. And students learning from her case know exactly what she taught the world. That brilliance doesn't always wear a lab coat. And sometimes, the hero is the one holding the tray, not the chart. So if you've ever been overlooked, if you've ever been told to stay in your place, if you've ever carried truth that no one wanted to hear, remember Naomi. Remember that the systems we trust can fail, not because they lack knowledge, but because they refuse to recognize where it truly lives. And if this story moved you the way it moved us to share it, take a second to like this video. Subscribe for more stories just like Naomi's, powerful, personal, and impossible to ignore. Your voice matters. And sometimes, the world just needs one person brave enough to use it.